On April 21, 1973, a 6'9" man drove east through the Colorado desert, pulled over at a rest stop in Pueblo, and called the Santa Cruz police to confess to 8 murders. They didn't believe him. He waited by the phone booth until officers arrived to arrest him. Behind him in California, his mother's body had been in her house for 3 days. How does a man kill his own mother, invite her best friend over, kill her too, then simply drive away and turn himself in from a payphone 1,000 miles away? The first officer who took that call thought it was a prank. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll walk through 6 co-eds, 2 grandparents, 1 mother, 1 final house guest, and the single childhood detail that Kemper himself pointed to as the beginning of everything. Detail number 3, the one about the closet, is the one investigators still describe as the key to understanding him. If you follow serial murder cases told without sensationalism, subscribe. On dark cases, we cover a new one every week. Edmund Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. By adolescence, he already stood over 6 feet tall. By the time of his arrest in 1973, he was 6 feet 9 inches and weighed close to 300 pounds. His intelligence, later measured in prison, was reported at an IQ well above 130. None of these numbers explain what he did. They only frame the man who did it. His parents, Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Stage, divorced when he was 9. According to Kemper's own statements in later interviews, his mother was the dominant figure in his early life, and their relationship was the central corrosive fact of his childhood. Clarnell was, by multiple accounts, including those of her co-workers at the University of California, Santa Cruz, an intelligent, hard-working, and difficult woman who drank heavily and argued loudly. Kemper claimed she belittled him constantly, told him no woman would ever love him, and, according to his testimony, forced him to sleep in a locked basement because she feared he might harm his younger sister. That basement detail is the one flagged in the opening. It is not embellishment. Kemper described it in multiple interviews, including the ones conducted by FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Resler in the late 1970s, which became foundational material for what the Bureau later called criminal profiling. He said the basement had a single bulb, a bare mattress, and a trapdoor at the top of the stairs. He said he lay awake, listening to the house above him. Whether every element of his account is exactly as he described it is impossible to verify. What is verified is that he told this story consistently for decades, and that he named it over and over as the place where his fantasies began. Before he ever hurt a person, he hurt animals. When he was around 10, he buried the family cat alive, then dug it up, decapitated it, and kept the head. A second family cat, years later, was killed with a knife. He would later say, with a chilling matter-of-factness, that his violence started with things smaller than himself and grew from there. His sisters reported that he played disturbing games, including one in which he asked to be tied to a chair and pretended to be executed in a gas chamber. These are not rumors invented after his arrest. They appear in court records and in the interviews his own family gave to investigators. In 1963, Clarnell sent 14-year-old Edmund to live with his paternal grandparents, Edmund Kemper Sr. and Maud Kemper, on their ranch in North Fork, California. He did not want to go. His grandmother, according to his statements, was strict and, in his words, emasculating in a way that reminded him of his mother. On August 27, 1964, at the age of 15, he shot his grandmother in the kitchen with a .22 caliber rifle. When his grandfather returned home from grocery shopping, Edmund shot him too, in the driveway, so that, as he later told police, the older man wouldn't have to find his wife's body. Then he called his mother. She told him to call the police. He did. He was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane, where he spent 5 years. According to hospital records and his own later statements, he was a model patient. He worked in the psychology lab. He was reportedly permitted to help administer tests to other inmates. He said in a much-quoted interview that he learned exactly what psychiatrists wanted to hear. In 1969, at 21, he was released, and against the recommendation of some of the doctors who evaluated him, he was released into the custody of the one person no clinician should have chosen: his mother. By then, Clarnell was working as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Edmund moved into her apartment. He tried to build a normal life. He took community college classes. He applied to become a state trooper and was rejected for his size. He got a job with the California Department of Transportation. He bought a used Ford Galaxy. He began in his off hours driving. And here we reach the years that gave him his name. Between May 1972 and February 1973, Edmund Kemper murdered 6 young women in and around Santa Cruz County. Most were college students. He picked them up hitchhiking, a common practice in California in the early 70s, and in the specific corridor between Berkeley, Santa Cruz, and San Francisco, it was so common as to be unremarkable. Kemper, who by then had obtained a university parking sticker of his mother's, blended in. He was calm, articulate, oversized in a way that could seem harmless, and he had a habit of talking about ordinary things. The first were Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, both 18, both students at Fresno State. On May 7, 1972, they were hitchhiking to Stanford University to visit friends. Kemper picked them up on the freeway. Their remains were later found in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Their families spent years trying to reconstruct what had happened to them, and I will not stage those hours for entertainment. What matters is that Kemper had crossed a line he had not crossed since he was 15, and he did not, this time, call the police. On September 14, 1972, he picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, who had missed a bus and was hitchhiking to a dance class in San Francisco. On January 8, 1973, he picked up Cindy Shaw, a 19-year-old student at Cabrillo College. On February 5, 1973, he picked up Rosalind Thorpe, 23, and Alice Liu, 21, both students at UC Santa Cruz. He used his mother's university sticker. He drove them past the campus checkpoint without being stopped. During this same period, the Santa Cruz area was living through what local newspapers called a nightmare year. There were, in fact, 3 separate active serial killers operating in or near the county at roughly the same time. John Linley Frazier, who had murdered a family in 1970. Herbert Mullen, who killed 13 people between October 1972 and February 1973 out of a delusional belief that he was preventing earthquakes, and Kemper. Investigators did not initially know the co-ed killings were the work of a single person. The disappearances stretched across jurisdictions, and there was little physical evidence tying the cases together. What is documented, and what Kemper later confirmed in detail, is that he took the bodies of his victims back to the house he shared with his mother. He did this, he said, because he needed to feel he was in control of them completely. He hid remains in the crawl space beneath the floor, in the yard, and in the mountains. In one interview, he said his mother once complained about a smell in the house, and he told her it was a dead animal in the walls. Whether that specific exchange happened exactly as he described it is not independently verified, but the pattern that he brought his crimes home and that his mother lived above them is documented in the physical evidence recovered after his arrest. Here is the mini cliffhanger the case itself hands us. For nearly a year, an intelligent, articulate parolee with a documented history of double homicide walked in and out of a university where his mother worked, drove past campus security with her sticker, and murdered students his mother taught alongside. And no one, in the entire system that had released him, checked back in. On Easter weekend, April 20, 1973, Kemper's story turned inward one final time. Clarnell came home late from a party. According to Kemper's confession, they argued. He waited until she was asleep. In the early morning of April 21st, he killed her in her bed with a claw hammer. The specifics of what he did to her body afterward are widely reported, but I am not going to stage them here. What matters, and what he himself emphasized in interviews for the rest of his life, is that his mother was the target he had been circling the whole time. Every young woman he had killed, he said, was in some sense a stand-in for the woman he could not confront. The co-eds were, in his words, practice. That statement is his interpretation, not an established clinical fact, but it is the way he consistently framed his own crimes. He then called Sarah Taylor Hallett, a 59-year-old friend of his mother's, and invited her over for a surprise dinner in his mother's honor. When she arrived, he killed her too. He left a note on the kitchen counter. It read in part that appearances would suggest his mother had been, quote, rather unexpectedly murdered, end quote, and that he was not going to be around long enough to be caught up in the aftermath. He took Mrs. Hallett's car and began driving east. He drove for roughly 24 hours, stopping only for gas and coffee, listening to the radio for news of the discovery. There was none. His mother's body was not yet found. Somewhere in Colorado, in a town called Pueblo, he pulled over at a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz police. He identified himself. He told them he was the co-ed killer. They initially did not believe him. He had, after all, been in casual contact with several Santa Cruz officers in the past year at a bar frequented by local police called the Jury Room, where he was known and liked as a large, quiet regular. He had to call 3 times, giving specific details about the murders, before officers were dispatched to arrest him. He waited by the phone. When police arrived, he was calm. He surrendered without incident. His confession, delivered over several days and thousands of pages of transcript, was staggering in its completeness. He described each murder in sequence. He drew maps of where remains could be found. He corrected investigators when they misremembered a date. He was, by every account of the officers who interviewed him, cooperative to the point of unnerving. He seemed relieved. His trial began in October 1973 in Santa Cruz County. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, the 6 co-eds, his mother, and Sarah Hallett. His defense attempted an insanity plea. 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined him and concluded that he was legally sane. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. On November 8, 1973, he was convicted on all 8 counts. He asked publicly to be executed. California had suspended the death penalty the year before, following the state Supreme Court's decision in People v. Anderson. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. As of the most recent parole hearings, all of which he has either waived or been denied, he has never been released and has said on the record that he does not believe he should be. There is one more part of this case that matters, and it is why criminologists still study Kemper decades later. Between 1979 and the early 1980s, FBI agents Robert Resler and John Douglas conducted a series of long-form interviews with incarcerated serial murderers as part of what the Bureau called the Criminal Personality Research Project. Kemper was one of their earliest and most cooperative subjects. He was articulate. He reflected on his own psychology. He spoke about triggers, fantasies, escalation, and cooling-off periods with the vocabulary of a clinician. The framework that emerged from those interviews, later codified in the FBI's early profiling manuals, drew directly on Kemper's self-analysis. That is a fact worth sitting with. A significant portion of the modern language we use to talk about serial offenders, the categories of organized versus disorganized, the concept of the signature versus the modus operandi, the emphasis on childhood indicators, was shaped in part by conversations with a man who had killed 10 people, including his mother, and who was consciously, deliberately, helping the Bureau build a tool to catch people like him. Whether that cooperation was genuine remorse, intellectual vanity, or another form of the control he had always sought is a question investigators still argue about. Resler himself, in his later writings, described Kemper as one of the most self-aware offenders he ever interviewed, and also one of the most disturbing, precisely because of that self-awareness. And this brings us back to the numbered promise from the opening: the basement, the closet, the locked door at the top of the stairs. Kemper pointed to that room again and again as the origin of his fantasies. He said he lay in the dark and imagined what he might do if he ever got out. It is tempting to accept that story as the clean explanation, the moment that made the man. But children are locked in dark rooms every day and do not grow up to kill 10 people. The basement is not a cause. It is a data point. What Kemper had, that most survivors of terrible childhoods do not, was a specific, escalating pattern of violent fantasy that began with animals and reached its clinical adult form when he was 15 years old, standing in his grandparents' kitchen with a rifle. Everything after that was, in his own words, a rehearsal for the person he actually wanted to kill, who was sleeping in the room above his. The questions this case leaves open are not about who or how. They are about the system. Why was a boy who murdered his grandparents at 15 released at 21 into the custody of his mother, whom he had explicitly named in prior evaluations as the source of his rage? Why did the doctors who cleared him not follow up? Why, when 6 young women disappeared in a single county over 10 months, did the investigation not connect faster to a paroled double murderer with a university parking sticker and a known pattern? None of these questions has a satisfying answer. Kemper himself, when asked in a 1984 interview what he thought should have stopped him, said quietly that any adult paying attention could have stopped him at 15, and that after that, he was not sure anyone could have. He is, at the time of this recording, still alive, still in Vacaville, still refusing parole. His mother has been dead for over 50 years. The 6 women he killed on those California roads were, before they were anything else, students on their way somewhere, to a dance class, to a friend's apartment, to a weekend visit. Their names deserve to be said again, not as characters in his story, but as the people they were. Marianne Pesce, Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, Alice Liu, and Sarah Hallett, who came for dinner. That is the list. That is the case. If this case stayed with you, don't leave without subscribing. On Dark Cases, we publish a new investigation every week, and next week's file involves a locked hotel room, a missing security tape, and a guest who checked in under a name that did not exist. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments which unsolved or undercovered case you want us to open next. We read every one.